Today we're going to review the installation of a server software, Windows Server 2012, as well as creating a couple of Windows client computers. We haven't done that so far, so it's going to be a good review to do that, good introduction to do that. After we create those machines, we'll be having them join the domain and kind of put this all together, kind of a refresher and starting from the beginning. The first thing we want to do is we do want to install Windows Server 2012 again. This is the configuration we're working with. We'll be working within the VMware Network NAT environment, which is the 192.168.118.0 network. The default gateway or the router that gets us off this network is 192.168.118.2, and we do want to give this server a static IP address of 192.168.118.100. This is ultimately going to be our domain controller, and that'll make more sense as we get into that later on. But we're going to name the computer LTC-DC. To go through this process, we're going to use VMware Workstation. This is VMware Workstation 10. It's very similar to what you have with 9 if you haven't upgraded yet. And I do want to create a new virtual machine. I choose Custom, and I click Next. This is one difference that I'll be having on here is I want to make sure it's compatible with all the other workstations that we have, so I'll make sure I choose VMware Workstation 9 compatibility. And I click Next. I'll install the operating system later on, and I click Next again. It's going to ask me what version of the operating system I'm going to be installing. Under Microsoft Windows, I will choose Windows Server 2012. This is a really important step here, is the location of these files and making sure that we put our virtual machine on our portable hard drives or wherever we want to be storing that. I'm going to click Browse, and I'll look for my D drive. And on my D drive, I have a folder for virtual machines. And underneath virtual machines, I do sort them out by class, so Server 1. I want to make a new folder for my my LTC domain controller. So I'll make a new folder for that, and I'll call it LTC-DC. It can be named anything that you want. Just keep track of which servers are where. And I click OK. LTC-DC. To keep things really consistent, what's going to show up on the window of the virtual machine will be on this tab. So I want to enter LTC-DC for the virtual machine name and put in the same folder name. I click Next. Number of processors defaults to 1, which is fine. The amount of memory defaults to 2 gigabytes, which is fine. And this is making sure that I do have a NAT environment. That's going to make sure that I'm working within here, so the right IP addresses of the 192.168.118 range. So I click Next. Next, several screens deal with the storage. All of them are fine for the defaults. 60 gigabytes is fine. And I'm finished. Building a virtual machine this way is essentially putting the hardware together. I'm pulling things off the shelf. I put in a processor, I put in RAM, I put in a hard drive, I have a CD-ROM drive, I have a sound card, I have a display. All those things are kind of built. Now I want to install the operating system. To do that, I want to click on the CD-ROM, and instead of installing a physical CD, which I could do, I'm going to use an ISO image. I click on Use ISO Image, and I browse, and now I have to find where I keep my ISO images. I keep them on my D drive underneath an ISO images folder, and I have a special one for the server admin class. These are all evaluation software versions, a little bit different than the ones that require keys, that you are required to enter a key or that you can sort of skip. These are truly evaluation ones. In this instance, the Server 2012 lasts for 180 days. I want to choose the Windows Server 2012 ISO, and I click Open, and I click OK. It's the same thing as putting a physical CD into the CD-ROM. I can power on the virtual machine now, and I'm going to go through the regular installation of the server. To switch the screen a little bit, I'm going to hit Control, Alt, and Enter to put it in full screen mode. It's a little bit easier to feel like you're on the server. instead of having all the different windows, tabs, and menus on there. And I want to choose the default English, United States. I click Next and Install Now. I have another option here of which operating system I want to install. I want to do the Standard Edition, and I have the GUI option and the Server Core. I will be using the GUI one, so I'm going to click GUI and then click Next. I read the terms, the license terms, and I accept them, and I click Next again. I don't want to upgrade. I don't have an operating system to upgrade from, so I have to choose Custom. That's when you install Windows from scratch. I only have one hard drive to choose from. If I had multiple hard drives in the server, I'd have to choose which one I want to install it on. And I click Next again. And now let it do its copying and installing the files. The computer's going to restart several times, and when it's finally finished, it's going to come up and ask you for an administrator password. We're going to use capital P A $$W0RD. We're going to enter that again, capital P A $$W0RD. When complete, it'll bring you to the login screen. You hit Control-Alt-Delete normally. In the virtual machines, we're using Control-Alt-Insert. It's going to ask you for the password for the administrator account, which is the password we just created, capital P A $$W0RD. And it's going to create a policy profile for this person, for this administrator account. Once the server starts, it's going to start Server Manager automatically. We're not going to do anything with Server Manager right now. The very first thing that we do want to do is install VMware Tools for the server. It's going to optimize the screen, the processor, and some other features. So I can close Server Manager. We're going to end up rebooting, so it's going to come back up anyway. I go up to my VM menu. Up in my menu in VMware Workstation, I go to VM, and I choose Install VMware Tools. I want to click Install. And up in the corner, I may get this screen and say tap to choose what happens with this disk. If I don't get that screen, I might have to scroll down to the bottom, depending on what the screen resolution is, and scroll down and see. Another way I can access this is go to my File Manager and double click. I can go to Computer, and I should have a D drive that's listed as VMware Tools. If I double click on VMware Tools, it should start the VMware Tools installation process. I click Next, and I'll be choosing the typical install. And I click Install. When you're finished, click Finish. And then do you want to restart? Yes, I do. When I come back to the login screen, I can hit Control-Alt-Insert again. Log in with my password for the administrator account. I wait for Server Manager to launch automatically. And now I do want to customize some of the server configurations. So I want to configure this local server. It's the first option under my dashboard. So when I click on Configure this local server, one of the things I want to do is actually change the computer name. To change the computer name, I can click on the computer name, and it's going to bring me to the System Properties page. I click on Change button, and I want to change the computer name to LTC-DC, and I click OK again. You must restart to apply these changes. Click OK, and I want to close. I can restart right now since it wants me to change the computer name. I click Restart Now. When it comes back in, I can log in, Control-Alt-Insert, and use my password. Back in Server Manager, I'm going to continue configuring my local server. The rest of these changes won't require a restart, unlike the installing VMware tools and changing the computer name. So we should be able to make the rest of the changes now. Moving down the configuration, the first thing I probably want to change is my IP address. Right now it's being assigned automatically by DHCP. To change that to the static address that I'd chosen, I click on the link. It's going to bring up the network connections page. I go to my Ethernet adapter and I right click and go to Properties. Find TCP/IP version 4, select that and choose Properties. And I want to give it a static IP address, so I'll use the following IP address. My IP address, make sure I click numlock, is 192.168.118.100. It figures out automatically that's a Class C subnet mask, and that is correct. Now my default gateway, if I go back to my drawing, it's going to tell me that it's 192.168.118.2. Typically it's going to be .1 in most networks. VMware Workstation uses .2 as a default gateway. I also need to include a preferred DNS. This is for you to be able to resolve a name, a domain name, to an IP address. I'll be using the same address, the default gateway address that's defined by VMware Workstation. It's 192.168.118.2. I click OK, and I can click Close, and I can close my network connections. Moving over, I can also change the time zone. The time zone is set to Pacific time. If I click on the time zone, it brings me up to the date and time window. I click on Change Time Zone, and I want to change it to Central Time, US and Canada. Some of the features that I may want to look into would be the updates of checking for Windows updates or scheduling them or determining how they're going to be installed automatically or manually. I'm not going to do that in this case, but that was something that you could do if you wanted to. At this point I have my local server built, and so this is a good starting point. It has my IP address, it has the settings that I want, it has VMware tools installed, so this would be a great time to take a snapshot of the server. The best way to take a snapshot is to shut down the server. So I'm going to close Server Manager, go over to the corner, go up to Settings, Power, and Shut Down. This is a planned down. And I go to VM, go to Snapshot, take a snapshot. I'm going to call this a base image. And I have my first machine configured. The next thing I want to do for my server environment is to actually build a client computer. Right now everything's just me standalone. I'll hook everything up together later on. The first thing I want to do is create a Windows 7 computer. To do that, I go back to VMware Workstation. I go up to my menu. And I do File, New Virtual Machine. Now at this point, making sure that you have all the ISO images, there's a possibility that you might have to download some files. To do that, you can go to the network share. You have to do this from the classroom. It's / 172.16.192.20. On that network share, you should see a class folder. Open up the class folder. There will be a server admin 1 folder. Underneath here should be all the files that you would need, including Windows Server 2012, Windows 7, and also we're having a Windows 8 that we'll be installing later on as well. This is also the same place, kind of unrelated, is where you can find the new VMware software under VMware Workstation. If you need a new product key for your 9 version, this is where you can find it. It's the product key under VMware Workstation 9. Or if you want to download and install the new version 10, you can double click on there. There's a product key and the software that you need for that. Going back to the class folder though, make sure that you have all these ISO images downloaded because we'll be installing Windows 7 now. Going back to the installation, I'm going to do a custom creation of a virtual machine. And again, I'm going to make it compatible with all the rest, so there's not an incompatibility issue by choosing Windows VMware Workstation 9. I'll install the operating system later. This time when I'm installing it, I'm going to be installing Windows 7, and it is a 64-bit version, so I'm going to choose that. I click Next. Naming is very important again, and making a new folder for this, so I'm going to browse. Go to my computer and look for my D drive. Under my D drive, I'm going to my virtual machines folder and my server 1 folder. Under server 1, I want to make a new folder and I'll call it Windows 7 Client. Make sure that's what I chose. Up in the VMware name, the VM name, I'm going to call it the same thing, just to keep things consistent. Windows 7 Client. 1 processor, 2 gigs of RAM, the NATed network environment, and a 60 gigabyte hard drive. Now that I've put the hardware together, I want to install the operating system. To choose that, I click on the CD-ROM DVD drive, and I click on Use the ISO image for my Windows 7. I browse to my ISO images folder under Windows, and I choose Windows 7 Professional, and I click OK. It does actually look like this might be the 32-bit. It's not going to make any difference for what we're doing. It's just using a client computer. Once I've installed that into the CD-ROM drive, I can power on the virtual machine. I'll leave all the defaults as far as language as English, United States, and I click Next and Install Now. Unlike the Windows Server 2012, it doesn't give me an option of which type of version of Windows 7 I want to install. It just starts the installation process. I want to read the license and terms and agree to it, and click Next. And just like in the Server 2012, I want to choose the Custom or the Advanced, which is installing a new copy of Windows on my only hard drive. And it starts the installation. After the computer restarts, it's going to ask you for the first user account. This first student we'll use, we'll just call it Student. I'm going to rename the computer right away, and we'll call it Win7. Click Next. It's going to ask me for a password for that account. I'll use the same one as password, capital P, a $W0RD. You can type a password hint. I'm just going to type in password. Click Next. For this product, it's going to ask for a product key. We can skip this step in Windows 7. Ask me later for setting up for Windows for updating Windows. The time zone is asked here. I'm changing from Pacific Time to Central Time, United States. And click Next. And I'm on a network environment. Once the computer starts up, I do also want to install VMware tools on this computer. Go up to the VM menu, choose Install VMware Tools. I can click under the File Manager, go to Computer, and go to my D drive. It's going to launch the install program. I click Yes. I click Next for the installation of VMware tools. I'll choose a typical install again, click Next, and then Install. When it's finished, I can click Finish. It's going to ask me to restart. I can click Yes, and it'll restart my computer. After I restart the computer, come back to the login screen. I can log in with my password. And as of this point, I've created another standalone computer. This is Windows 7. This would be a good time to take a snapshot of this. The best way to take a snapshot is to shut down the computer. I click on Start, Shut Down. After it's shut down, I can go up to VM, Snapshot, and take a snapshot. I'm going to call it my base image again. Going over to my diagram, the next thing I want to do is create a Windows 8 computer. Just a standalone computer at this point. We'll join them all in the domain later on. To create the Windows 8 computer, I go back to VMware Workstation. I'm going to choose File, New Virtual Machine. I'm going to click Next on Custom, and I'm going to use the hardware compatibility of Workstation 9 again, and click Next. I'll install the operating system later. It's going to ask me for the operating system. I'll choose Microsoft Windows, and I'll choose Windows 8 64-bit, and click Next. Now when I choose the location of the folder, I want to make sure I put it in the same location, definitely not on my C drive. I'm going to put it on my computer, on my D drive, under Virtual Machines, and under Server 1. I'll make a new folder called Windows 8 Client. And click OK. And I'll rename the computer name, the virtual machine name, the same thing to have it match Windows 8 Client. When I click Next, it's going to go through the defaults of a single processor, 2 gigs of RAM, and adding a 60 gigabyte hard drive. When I'm done with that process, I want to insert the CD-ROM into the CD-ROM drive so I can install the operating system now. I do that again by double-clicking the CD-DVD drive and going over to use this ISO image. I browse for that image. I go to my D drive, ISO images, and under Windows, and I have mine under Server Admin. I'm going to choose Windows 8 64-bit. This is a special evaluation version. If you don't include this one, if you don't use this one for your virtual machine, you're going to be prompted to enter a product key and you won't be able to get past it. This one does not require a product key, but does have a 180-day expiration date on it. So making sure the right file, I'm going to click Open and click OK. I'm going to power on this virtual machine. The installation process is going to be very, very similar to Windows Server 2012. It's going to have the same look. It's going to have the default of language of English and the format of United States. I click Next, and I click Install Now. I read and accept the license agreement, and I click Next. I need to choose the custom or the advanced install. That's setting it up on a new Windows installation. Choose the only available drive, drive 0. Click Next. And it's going to copy and then install the features and do the updates. After the setup is complete, it'll reboot and bring you up into the personalization screen. For the PC name, we're going to call it Win8. And I click Next. At this point, I can use the Express settings or I can customize. I'll use the Express settings. Once we sign into your PC, to my PC, using a Windows login, I'm going to sign in without a Microsoft account. And I'm going to use a local account. In this case, I'm going to use the username student again. Same password, capital PA $$ $W0RD. with a password hint of password. When I'm all done with that, I click Finish. It can take a while for your computer to start up for the first time. Once you do, the first thing we want to do again is install VMware Tools. I go up to the VM menu up on top. I click on VM and install VMware Tools. I want to click Install. I'll give it a minute and I should get the prompt. Choose what happens with this disk. I click on it on top. If I do miss that, I am still able to go into the Windows File Manager and be able to choose my D drive and select Setup as well. I'm going to run the run Setup 64. Choose Yes. When I finally get the setup screen, I can click Next, and I'll choose a typical install and click Next again, and install. When it's finished, I click Finish, and it's asking me to restart. I'm going to choose Yes. When I come to the login screen, I click on the screen. It brings up the login. I enter a password. I'm now on this computer. This computer is all set up at a basic level, so I'm going to take a snapshot of this computer. I'm going to go down to the corner, bring up the Charms bar, go to Settings, Power, and Shut Down. After it's shut down, I'll go to VM, Snapshots, and take a snapshot. And I'll call it my base image. So what I've done so far is create a standalone server, a standalone Windows 7 client, and a standalone Windows 8 client. All the computers right now are on the network together, and they can share via peer-to-peer file sharing, but they all have to be managed separately. The student account that I created on Windows 7 is completely different than the student account that's created on Windows 8. If the account was changed or renamed, it only applied to that one computer, not the other. If the password gets changed, it only applies one to the other. There is no student account on LTC DC, so you'd have to create one if you wanted that user to do that. It gets very confusing and very complicated to be working with a system like that, and that's why we came up with a process of using a directory. In Windows' case, it's called Microsoft's case, it's called Active Directory Domain Services. And when I do that, it is working it as a whole. Think of it as a gatekeeper. There's a database that's created with all the user accounts. It's stored in one location. The domain I'm going to be creating is going to be called ltc.com, and I'm going to be storing the database on this server. It could be in a separate server. It could be, it doesn't have to that first server. It could be any server that you want, but there has to be a physical location for that database to be stored. So that's the process we're going to do right now. First of all, installing Active Directory, and then making that database on that server, making that the domain controller. To do that, I'm going to need my LTC DC server. I'm going to launch that. When I log in, Control-Alt-Insert to log in. Type in my password. After the Server Manager is completely loaded, I can click on Add Roles and Features. And again, it's a two-step process. The first step is actually installing Active Directory, and then the second step is making it into a domain controller, making the server into a domain controller. So I click Next. And I only have one server listed in my server pool, which is my LTC DC server. I click Next, and now I want to select Active Directory Domain Services. When I select that, it wants to install other features as well, and I'll click Add Features, and I click Next. It wants to do a couple more features, and I click Next again. I choose the default for Active Directory Domain Services here. and I finally click install after verifying that this is what I want. When this is completed, it'll say installation succeeded. You can click close. At this point, you need to still do the DC promo or promoting it to a domain controller. You can do that by clicking on the notifications icon up on the top of the screen. And when you do that, you can choose the option promote this server to a domain controller. It's going to take you through a wizard through this process. If I had an existing domain, I can just add this domain controller to an existing domain. I do not have one, so I'm really creating a new forest. The root domain name is, I want it to be called ltc.com. I click next. I'll leave all the defaults up on the top. On the bottom, it does ask you for a directory services restore mode password. It can be different than the administrator password. Just for this case, we'll make it the same. I click next. And pretty much the defaults for us these. I click next. It's going to look for a NetBIOS domain name. It's going to fill it in automatically. When it does, you can click next. The locations of these folders are all fine by default. Click next. I review the options and I click next again. After verifying all the prerequisites, as long as there's no red indications that something is a severe error, we can go ahead and install this. When it's all complete, it's going to reboot and bring you back to the login screen. Control-Alt-Insert. You can see now that I'm logging into the domain rather than just the generic account administrator. So I've created this domain. At this point, I want to be adding Windows 8 computer to the domain, having it join the domain so it's controlled and managed by the domain controller as opposed to being managed individually. To do that, I need to get to the Windows 8 computer and power it on. I want to make sure I keep my Windows Server 2012 server running. And it's a two-step process. Adding it to a domain is not that difficult. One step that has been done prior to that is under the IP configuration, is you do need to configure the DNS, the domain name server. By default, it's going to be looking out to the network and for resolving those domain names. When you're trying to locate the domain ltc.com, it's not going to be able to find it. So it needs to be pointing to the domain controller itself as the DNS. To log in, I click on the picture, brings up the login screen. I type in password. And the first thing I want to do is change the DNS configuration. There's a couple ways of doing that. One way is going by the desktop, clicking on the desktop, then right-clicking on your network connection and going to Open Network and Sharing Center. There are other ways of doing that. If you prefer, you certainly can. I want to change the adapter settings, and I have my Ethernet adapter. I right-click on my Ethernet adapter, and I go to Properties. I find my TCP/IP version 4 and click on Properties again. And I do not want to change the top addresses. It can certainly be assigned through DHCP. It doesn't matter what my client's IP address is. It's just the DNS that I have to change. This is going to be the 192, make sure numlock is on, 192.168.118.100, which is your server's IP address, and then click OK, and then click Close. To actually join the domain now, we want to go to the computer configuration. A couple ways again of getting there. One way is by clicking on Windows Explorer and right-clicking on your computer and choosing Properties. When you do that, under the section named Computer Name, Domain, and Workgroup Settings, right now it's under the Workgroup. The computer name is Win8. I'm going to change those settings. And I want to change it again to rename the computer or change its domain. I click the Change button. I keep the computer name the same, but now I want to make it a member of the domain ltc.com. When I click OK, enter the name and password of an account with permissions to join the domain, and that would be your administrator account with the password of our special password. I click OK, and it says Welcome to ltc.com domain, and it wants me to restart my computer. After I click Close, I can click Restart Now. When I go to log in at this point, I click on the screen. You can see that it wants to log into the local user account. If I want to log into a different user account, something on the domain, I choose Other User. It wants to sign into the domain. This is where it gets a little confusing. It wants to sign to the domain if I want to type in anything else, such as Bob or Sally. If I type in administrator, it actually defaults back to the local computer, and I don't want that to happen. So if you want to log into the domain or force it to log into the domain, you need to include the domain first, name first, ltc/administrator. Now, I didn't have an administrator account on this local PC, so this is showing that it is actually logging onto the server. We'll create some user accounts later to show that we are logging into the domain as well. After we choose LTC administrator, type in our password, I can go ahead and log in. This is the first time that it logged on as administrator on this computer, so it's going to set up a whole new profile for this person. While we're waiting for that, we want to be adding this Windows 7 computer now to the domain as well. It's the same process where we had to change the DNS configuration for the IP address of the Windows 7 and then just have it join the domain. To do that, I want to launch my Windows 7 computer, power it on. I want to log in as my student account using the password. The same thing here. I want to change the DNS settings. I can right click on my network connections down the lower right hand corner, open Network and Sharing Center, change my adapter settings, right click on local area connection and choose properties. Choose TCP/IP version 4 and then choose properties. And again, leaving the IP addresses to obtain them automatically, but use the following DNS server address. Again, make sure numlock is on and type 192.168.118.100 and click OK and close. And I can close the network connections window. I can click on the Start button. I can get to my computer options here. So I can right click on Computer and go to Properties. In the same area, the computer name, domain, and workgroup settings, I want to change those settings. To rename the computer or change its domain, click Change. So I click Change. I leave the computer name as Win7, which is fine, but I do want to make it a member of the ltc.com domain by clicking Domain and then typing in ltc.com. I click OK. Again, it's asking for an account with permissions to join that domain. I will type in administrator with my password. Welcome to the domain. I click OK. It wants me to restart after I close these windows. I click Close and I will restart. So at this point, I have my network, my VMware NATed network. Inside of it, I had three individual computers. I made a domain. I made my LTC domain controller server a domain controller, and then I joined the Windows 7 and Windows 8 computer into that domain. What I'm going to do now is actually create a couple of users on the domain controller to show of how that you would actually log in from those clients then. So I'm going to go to my domain controller. And I can go up to Tools. I got the Tools, Active Directory, Users and Computers. When it comes up, I'm just going to make a couple generic users just to show this process. I can click on the little down arrow next to ltc.com and then click on Users. These users are all created by default. I want to add a couple additional ones. I can right click down here on the open area and click on New User. I'll call my first student Student 1 with a login of student with a number 1. Click Next. It's going to ask for a password. We'll use the same password. But I'm not going to make the user change the password to first login. I'm also going to make it, just for these cases, that the password never expires, so I don't have to worry about making a new password for these users. And I click Next. I have student 1. I want to make a new student, so I right click again, click New User, and I'll call it Student 2 with a login of Student 2. We'll use the same password. And turn off user must change the password, and the password never expires. Now I'll click Next and Finish. So I have these two users now, Student 1 and Student 2. I'm going to switch over to my my different clients now. So let's go to Windows 7 Client, and this brings me to the login screen. If I do Control-Alt-Insert, because I'm a virtual environment, it wants to bring me into that student account on the local machine again. I don't want to do that. I want to switch to a different user. So I'll click on Other User. And again, it's going to be looking at logging to the domain by default. If I type in administrator, it's going to switch the default to the local machine. To force it to log into the domain, I have to add the LTC / for the administrator account. Any other account, it's not going to. So if I choose Student 1, which is on the domain, not on this local computer, and log in, I'm able to log onto this computer. It's creating a profile for me on this computer for the Student 1 account, and I'm logged into the domain as that user. Switching over to my Windows 8 client, if I click on the little user account in the upper right hand corner, I can actually sign out or log out of this computer. After I sign out, I can click on this screen again. I want to choose another user. And I'm going to be logging in as Student 2 this time. If you notice, it's trying to log into the domain, the LTC domain, and I'll use my password. And once again, it's a brand new profile for this computer, so it might take a few minutes to actually set up that profile on this computer. So again, looking at this process, we now have a domain controller with a Windows 7 and a Windows 8 client all working together as a domain. The domain controller is now going to be able to physically control these computers under computer management and under group policy objects computers, and the users individually like Student 1 or Student 2. I don't have to worry about configuring or securing these computers individually anymore. It's all done at the domain level. And that is Active Directory Domain Services. After successfully logging into all your computers and everything running fine, you can shut them all down, and this would be again a perfect time to take some more snapshots.